Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. I process images for a living. That's the simplest way to say it. The longer version is that I take raw visual data, the kind that comes back from satellites and survey equipment and occasionally spacecraft, and I run it through processing software until it becomes something clean enough to publish or use. I correct for noise, compensate for transmission interference, fix the things that distance and atmosphere and equipment limitations do to an image on its way from wherever it started to the screen where someone eventually needs to look at it. It's technical work. It's quiet work. It suits me. My name is Silas Monk. I'm 34 years old, and I do all of this from a home office in a house I rent outside a small town called Dunbar, Vermont. The house is older than it looks, which is saying something because it looks pretty old. And it has a good office with north-facing windows that keep the glare off my monitors, and a yard that backs up to a tree line that turns a color in October I haven't gotten tired of in 3 years of living here. I drive into Dunbar for groceries twice a week. I have a cat named Wren who supervises my work from the corner of my desk, and a neighbor named Fen who fixes small engines out of his garage and is the kind of person who'll give you 20 minutes on the finer points of a carburetor rebuild if you make the mistake of looking mildly interested. I'm fine with my life. I'm not someone who needs it to be more than it is. I've been doing image processing work for 8 years across a range of clients. Most of it's mundane: geological survey imagery, agricultural aerial photography, real estate satellite work. 4 years ago, I picked up a contract through a man named Dale Purcell, who works for a private aerospace company that handles data processing work from larger agencies. The space-adjacent jobs come infrequently, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, but they pay well, and the work is interesting in the way that images from very far away are always interesting. You're cleaning up a picture of something nobody standing on the ground will ever see with their own eyes. There's something to that. Dale's efficient and professional. His emails are short and clear. He's never once sent me ambiguous instructions or been difficult to reach when I had a question. In 4 years of working together, I'd come to trust the predictability of him the way you trust any system that's never given you a reason not to. 8 months ago, he sent me a file. Everything I'm writing now comes from what I found in it. The email looked like every other email Dale had ever sent me. A project number, a file attachment, a set of instructions. The job was to process the final image transmission from a deep space probe that had recently gone silent after a long mission. The probe had been in operation for years and had sent back a final data packet before losing contact. My job was to clean up the raw transmission file, correct for signal degradation over the transmission distance, and output a publication-ready image. Standard work. I'd done nearly identical jobs twice before through Dale. I didn't know the probe by name when I read the email. I don't follow space news. I downloaded the file, made myself a cup of coffee, and opened it in my processing software the way I open every file. My standard first step on any new file is to look at the raw data before I touch it, before any processing, before any correction. You get a sense of what you're working with that way. how much noise, what kind of interference, what the image is going to want from you before it becomes something usable. I've done this thousands of times. The raw file was a deep space image, stars at extreme distance, densely packed, very faint, the kind of image that looks like uniform static when you first open it and then slowly resolves as your eyes adjust to the depth of it. Nothing unusual about the subject matter. Deep space images have a particular quality that I've come to recognize, a texture of light and distance that's different from images taken closer in. The noise in this one was wrong. I noticed it within the first few minutes of looking at the raw file. Noise in a transmission image, interference and degradation accumulated over a signal's long journey back, distributes randomly. This isn't an assumption. It's a property of random interference. It has no preference for one part of the image over another. It doesn't organize itself. It doesn't repeat. It scatters the way scattered things scatter, without logic, without intention. The noise in this file wasn't scattered. I told myself it was compression. When files are packaged for transmission, they get compressed, and sometimes compression does strange things to the noise characteristics. I ran a preliminary processing pass, the lightest possible touch, just enough to start separating the image data from the interference layer. The noise layer was still organized after the pass. I tried 3 different isolation methods, pulling the noise layer away from the underlying image data in 3 different ways, each of which I'd used hundreds of times on other files. Each time I had the noise layer alone on my screen, it showed me the same thing. Not a random scatter, something with structure, not a shape I could name or trace an outline around. More like the difference between static on a television and a signal that's been scrambled. Static is random. A scrambled signal has something underneath it that's trying to come through. What I was looking at felt like the second thing, like something that was organized before it was disrupted, and the organization was still visible underneath the disruption if you knew what to look for. I didn't process the file that night. I closed my laptop and fed Ren and made dinner and watched something on television that I couldn't have told you the plot of an hour later. I went to bed at 9, which is early for me, and lay in the dark thinking about noise distributions until sometime after midnight when I finally fell asleep. In the morning, the file was still there, and I was still me, and the work still needed doing. I ran the full processing pass. The complete sequence, every correction and calibration in the right order. The whole job done the way Dale's instructions specified. The clean output image appeared on my screen after about 40 minutes of processing, and it was genuinely beautiful in the way that deep space images often are. Stars in their thousands, cold and precise. The black between them that deep space photography always makes look somehow more absolute than it looks to the naked eye. In the lower portion of the frame, the faint smeared glow of a distant galaxy, pale and diffuse, the kind of thing that looks almost like it shouldn't be there, the kind of image that gets printed in science publications and makes people feel small in a pleasant way. I exported it to the specifications Dale had outlined and sent it over. I've thought about that moment since, the moment of sending it. I'd done the job. The clean image was exactly what it was supposed to be. I could have closed the raw file and moved on. I didn't close the raw file. I went back to the noise layer. I spent the better part of the day working on it separately, treating it as its own image rather than as interference to be removed from another one. This isn't something I'd ever done before in 8 years of this work. Noise layers aren't images. They're the absence of clean signal. There's no professional reason to process one on its own. I did it because whatever was in there wasn't going to leave me alone until I understood it better, or tried to. And I've learned over the years to trust that particular feeling more than I trust the argument for leaving things alone. What I pulled out of the noise layer over several hours of careful work wasn't a shape. I want to be precise about this, because the temptation when writing about something like this is to give it a shape, to make it into a thing the mind can hold and examine. It didn't have a shape. It wasn't an object. What it was, the closest I can get to it, is the sense of proximity, the impression carried in the structure of that interference, that whatever the probe's camera was pointed at when this final transmission was sent wasn't the stars in the clean image, not the distant galaxy. Something between the probe and those things, something the probe was very close to when it sent back this last data packet, something that the standard processing pass had stripped out because it was in the noise layer, and the noise layer is interference, and interference gets removed. Except this wasn't interference in the usual sense. Near the upper right quadrant of the raw image, I found a seam, a line where the noise changed. On the left side of the line, the organized structure I'd been examining all day. On the right side, standard random interference, the ordinary chaos I'd been cleaning out of images for years. The organized structure stopped at the line and the random noise began, a border, a clear, unambiguous transition between two different kinds of space. The probe was at the edge of something when it sent this image. The probe was very close to the edge when it sent this image. And on the other side of the probe, in every direction the camera couldn't see, based on the way the organized noise filled the frame except for that one seam, was whatever it was at the edge of. I sat at my desk for a long time after I understood that. Ren jumped up and sat next to my keyboard, and I didn't notice her for what she later made clear, through the traditional methods, was an unacceptable length of time. I saved the isolated noise layer as a separate file. I almost deleted it. I didn't delete it. I called Dale the next morning. In 4 years, I'd called him maybe 6 times. Email is how we work. I called because I needed to hear his voice respond to what I was going to say, and email doesn't give you that. I needed the data of a real-time human reaction from someone who might know what this file actually was. He picked up on the second ring and sounded like himself, professional and straightforward, and asked what he could do for me. I told him what I found. I took my time with it and used precise language where I had it. The noise distribution in the raw file wasn't random. The noise layer, isolated from the image data, showed organized structure inconsistent with transmission interference. There was a seam in the upper right quadrant where the organized structure ended and standard random noise began. The probe appeared to have been at the boundary of something when the final transmission was sent. The clean output image I delivered didn't contain this information because the processing had removed it as interference. Dale didn't say anything for a moment. I'd expected something immediate, a technical explanation, a suggestion that I'd made an error somewhere, something that would let both of us stand on familiar ground. The silence wasn't that. When he spoke, he said he'd look at the raw file on his end and see if there was a processing explanation he could find. He said it carefully. I've processed that word many times since. Carefully, not dismissively, not the tone of a man managing an anxious contractor who's made an error. The tone of a man measuring each word before he puts it down. He called back 6 hours later. He said the contract was complete and the file had been received and processed satisfactorily, and there was no additional work on this project. He said it in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to sound like his normal voice, a voice that was close to his normal voice but assembled rather than natural, the way a person assembles a neutral expression when they're standing in a room where their expression is going to be read. I asked him directly if he'd looked at the noise layer. He said the file had been received and the contract was complete. The same words, precisely the same. Like he was reading from something, or like he'd decided on those words specifically and wasn't going to deviate from them. I said his name, just his name, meaning I hear what you're doing and I know what it means. He said it was good working with me on this one and to have a good rest of the week. And then he said, very quietly, right at the end, before he hung up, to please take care of myself. It was the last thing he said, and it wasn't a pleasantry. I've known Dale for 4 years. I've heard him handle difficult clients and equipment problems and the particular grinding stress of deadline pressure. In all of that, I'd never heard him sound like he did in that phone call, like a man who'd made a decision to be very still, like a man who'd looked at something and understood that looking at it was going to cost something and had decided to pay that cost as quietly as possible. I didn't contact Dale again. I don't have a large number of people in my life, and I became aware of this in a new and not particularly comfortable way in the days after that phone call. I thought about calling my sister Audra. She lives in Portland. She's 3 years older than me, and we talk every few weeks in the way that two people talk when they're genuinely fond of each other, but have built lives that don't have much geographic overlap. I considered calling her, and then I sat with what I'd actually say, and I put the phone down. I didn't want to hand this to someone I loved across a distance where I couldn't see their face. I ended up talking to Fen, which happened the way most things with Fen happen, accidentally. He came over to return a socket wrench he'd borrowed from me 3 weeks before and knocked on my door on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened the door and he looked at my face and asked right away if I was okay. Fen's not a person who asks questions he doesn't want answered. He's also not a person who performs concern he doesn't actually feel. He asked because something on my face apparently warranted asking. I told him to come in. I gave him the shape of it without the technical details. A probe had sent back a final image before it went dark. That image had something in its raw data that didn't appear in the version that got cleaned up and published. Whatever it was had been organized in a way that natural interference wasn't, and the probe had gone silent immediately after sending it, which the official explanation attributed to expected signal degradation, but which, given what the raw file showed, felt like something more specific than that. Fen sat across from me at the kitchen table with both hands around a coffee cup and listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. He asked me what I thought the thing in the image was. I'd been working my way toward an answer to that question for 3 days without wanting to arrive at it. Fen asking it out loud meant I had to say it out loud. I said I didn't think it was a thing in the way we normally mean when we say the thing. I said it was more like finding out that something you've always assumed was empty isn't empty. The way if you've lived in a house for years and believed the space inside the walls was just air and insulation, and then you find out it's never been air. It's always been something else. The house is the same house. The walls are real and the rooms are real. But the space between them isn't what you thought and has never been what you thought. And you've been walking past it every day of your life in that house without knowing what you were walking past. Fen held his coffee cup for a moment. He said that was a hard thing to know. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He didn't offer alternative explanations or suggest I'd made a mistake somewhere. He sat with me for another hour and drank his coffee, and we talked about other things, the engine he was working on, the first snow that was supposed to come at the end of the week. When he left, he put his hand on my shoulder briefly on his way out the door, the kind of gesture that doesn't need words attached to it. I felt better for the rest of that evening. I felt worse again by morning. I spent 3 days searching for public information about the probe's final transmission. There wasn't much, and what there was said very little. An official notice from the agency that had run the mission stated that the probe had ceased transmitting following a final data packet attributed to expected degradation of onboard systems at its operational distance, a routine end to a long mission. The clean output image I'd produced appeared in 2 science publications and several news sites within a week of my delivering it to Dale. It was described uniformly as a stunning final image from a landmark mission. One publication ran it across a full page. The galaxy in the lower portion of the frame had its own paragraph. No raw file. No mention of transmission anomalies. No mention of noise characteristics that deviated from expected parameters. No mention of the seam. I went back to the noise layer file. I'd been going back to it every day, and I was aware that doing so wasn't making me better, and I was doing it anyway. There's a thing that happens when you know something is in a file, when you've already seen it once, where you can't look at the file without looking for it again, like checking a wound. You know it's there. You know looking won't help it. You look anyway. On the 4th night, I tried something different. I mapped the noise layer as depth data. It's a method I'd used before on geological survey images, treating variation in the data as elevation information and building a topographic model out of it. It's a way of finding structure that doesn't announce itself visually. You're asking what shape would produce this pattern of variation, and sometimes the answer tells you something the flat image doesn't. I ran the depth model and looked at what came out. I sat with it for a long time. What the depth model showed wasn't a landscape. There were no peaks, no valleys, no variation of the kind that terrain produces or that any natural formation I'd ever processed produced. The depth model was consistent across the entire field, edge to edge, corner to corner, the same quality all the way through without interruption. an evenness that was total, a sameness that had no gaps in it, no irregularities, no places where it was different from every other place in the frame. The only time I've ever seen something like that in a depth model is when the subject is manufactured, when something's been made to a specification and the making was done well enough that the result is uniform. Rock isn't uniform, soil isn't uniform, ice isn't uniform. Nothing natural is uniform because nothing natural is made to a specification. Everything natural accumulates and varies and has the texture of time on it. This didn't have the texture of time on it. This had the texture of something that was made to fill a space and was made carefully and completely and had been doing so without interruption for longer than I had any way of measuring. I closed my laptop. I went outside. It was late and cold and clear, the first hard cold of the season, and the stars were out in the way they get out in Vermont in November, dense and close and impossibly sharp. I stood in my yard in my socks because I hadn't thought to put shoes on, and I looked up at the sky. The stars looked the same as they always had, every one of them. The same cold white points, the same black between them, the same sense of depth going back and back and back into distances the mind can reach for but not hold, the black between them. I'd always looked at that black and called it empty. I'd always looked at it and thought nothing. Background, absence, the stuff that wasn't there, which isn't something you look at, which isn't something you examine, because there's nothing there to examine. You look at the things, not the space between things. I stood in my cold yard and looked at the black between the stars, and I knew what I'd been looking at all my life. I went back inside. Silas still does the work. I want to say that because it seems important. The files still come in from other clients, and the work is still the same work it's always been, and there's still something steadying about the routine of it, the problem that's always solvable because it's a technical problem, and technical problems have methods. I'm glad for that steadiness, more than I used to be. Dale hasn't sent me anything since the project closed. I didn't expect that he would. I called Audra about a month after everything. I didn't tell her about the image. I called to hear about her week, her kids, the ordinary texture of her life in a city I visited twice and always found too loud. She asked me how I was doing, and I told her I was fine and I was close enough to fine that she believed me. We talked for an hour. It was good. I think about the probe when I can't sleep, which is more nights than it used to be. I think about how far out it was when it sent that last transmission, farther from Earth than anything built by human hands has ever traveled. It had been traveling for decades, moving through the space between our solar system and the next nearest star, the space that everyone who's ever thought about interstellar travel has always referred to as empty, the cold, empty void between stars. It's a phrase I've heard my whole life and never questioned because it seemed obviously true. You can look at it. It's dark. There's nothing there, except there is something there. There's always been something there. I've processed hundreds of images in 8 years. I've run deep space photographs through this same software with these same methods, and I've stripped the noise layer out of all of them and thrown it away, because that's what you do with noise. That's what it's for. You remove it. It's in the way of the image. I threw it away every time. I don't know how many of those noise layers had the same structure as this one. I don't know if I had the evidence on my own hard drive years before Dale sent me this file and deleted it without looking because deletion was the job. I think about that. I think about it more than is probably useful. The universe, when you get to the scale of the actual universe, is mostly the space between things. Mostly not stars or planets or anything with mass that registers on any instrument we've built. Mostly the dark. Mostly the enormous empty distance between every system and every galaxy and every cluster of galaxies. The dark that goes on for distances that make the distance between Earth and Jupiter feel like the space between two words on a page. If that dark isn't empty, if it's been filled and organized and maintained with the consistency I saw in that depth model, then the universe is mostly that, whatever it is. And everything else, every star and every planet and every moon and every living thing that's ever existed on any of them is the small part, the gaps, the spaces between an incomprehensibly vast something. We're not the inhabitants of the universe. We're the space inside it. I've turned that over many times, and I'm not done turning it over. I don't think I will be. The noise layer file is still on my hard drive. It's in a folder inside a folder with a name that doesn't describe what it is. The kind of place you put something when you want to be able to find it and also want to be able to forget it's there. I don't open it every day anymore. Some weeks I don't open it at all. But I haven't deleted it, and I'm not going to delete it because it's the only copy of what that raw image actually contained. The version that was processed out and papered over and presented to the world as a beautiful final photograph of stars and distant light. The version that nobody saw but me. Ren's asleep on my desk while I write this. The house is quiet. Outside the window above my monitor, the night is clear and the stars are doing what stars do, and the dark between them is doing what the dark between them does, what it's always done, what it'll keep doing long after the probe and the people who sent it and the planet they sent it from are gone. The probe reached the edge of it. I don't know what happened to the probe in the moments after it sent that final image. I have my guesses, and they're not comforting guesses. I think about something that's filled the space between stars, becoming aware that a small metal object from a small warm planet had gotten close enough to its edge to photograph it. I think about how you respond to that. If you're something that's existed on that scale for that long, I think about whether you respond at all, or whether the probe simply stopped the way an insect stops when the temperature drops past a certain point. Not killed exactly, just ended, the way things end when they encounter something they weren't built to encounter. I think about what it means that it let the image transmit first. That thought is the one I like least of all. The image was sent. The probe went dark. The file came to a contractor who sent it to a freelance image processor in Vermont, who did his job and then did a little more than his job and pulled something out of the noise that wasn't supposed to be findable. Dale closed the contract. The clean image ran in 2 publications and was called beautiful by people who had no reason to look any further than the surface of it. And whatever's out there in the dark between everything, whatever's been there since before this planet had anything living on it, whatever the probe found at the very edge of the space between our solar system and the next one is still there, the same as it's always been. The dark between the stars is the same dark it was last night and the night before, and every night going back further than any light currently reaching our eyes has been traveling. I know what it is now. I look at it anyway. I don't know what else to do with knowing except to look.